Hello everyone and welcome back to Chapter 2, Intercultural Communication. Previously we've been discussing what intercultural communication is. Now we're going to be discussing what are the differences between cultures. By understanding that, we will be better able to understand what culture is. So let's dive right on in with the cultural value dimensions. Messaging, identity, power, uncertainty, and sex roles, all of which are these main areas of distinction between different types of cultures. So we start with messaging. In some cultures, we have high context. We have low context, where language expresses thoughts, feelings, and ideas as directly as possible, and it relies very lightly on context. In these sorts of cultures, it is about communicating as clearly as possible, and it gets its name, low context, because it does not rely heavily on the context. Instead, it is direct. Whereas, in high context cultures, it relies heavily on subtle, often nonverbal cues in an effort to maintain social harmony. This relies very heavily on context. The reasons why the high context cultures are more subtle, are less direct, is in favor of politeness. And, as you can probably guess, when high context cultures communicate with low context cultures, the low context culture could see it as being unreasonably vague. Whereas on the flip side, a low context culture communicator communicating to a high context culture citizen would then see it as blunt or rude. So, for example, a low context coffee cup would have all of the information you could possibly need on that coffee cup. What it is, how they ground the coffee beans and all those fun things, as well as a illustration letting you know that it is indeed coffee. Whereas in a high context culture coffee cup, we simply have the cup, and that we can understand that it is coffee through the through the context that you are in a coffee shop. Next, we move on to mindset, and mindset is focused on individualism versus collectivism. Individualistic cultures primarily they're primarily they're primarily responsible to help oneself. Whereas in collectivistic cultures, loyalties and obligations to the in-group extended family, community, or work organization are the most important. So, where individuals it's about the I identity, collectivistic cultures are about the we identity. So, this expands to things like family, where the individualistic culture has a sees family as the nuclear family, that is, mother, father, children, that's it. Whereas a collectivistic culture would see family as the extended family, not just the nuclear, but also grandparents and uncles and aunts and all those things. And how we interact with individualistic cultures, privacy is important because it is about my identity and I don't want to share that. Whereas in collectivistic culture, it's more about relational harmony having to share. Uh, Individualistics value individual competition, whereas collectivistic talks about teamwork. Individualistic focus on personal competence. Collectivistic cultures focus on in-group emphasis, and that individualistic cultures will have more direct communication patterns and collectivistic cultures will have more indirect communication patterns. Individualistic individualistic cultures focus on an independent self, whereas a collectivistic culture focuses on an interdependent self. All of which to say that there are so many differences focusing on the mindset of people in individualistic and collectivistic cultures. And by having these differences, it makes it so that we are more that when we are interacting with those of different cultural contexts, we can learn a great deal from those who are different. A good example of this is individualistics tend to focus more on individual competition and personal competence, whereas collectivistics may tend to focus more on relational harmony, teamwork, and group emphasis and group work. And in sometimes group work may be more important. In some groups, individual achievement may be more important. All of which to say that we have a lot to learn from other groups, and when we have intercultural communication, then we can gain the benefits of both. Next, we talk about power distance. Power distance is the degree to which members of a society accept an unequal distribution of power. How do we see our politicians? Do we see them as that they are more powerful and that we are not powerful? Or do we see them as maybe even to the point where we are their boss, and that if they don't do what we want, then we vote them out of office? So, this very much speaks to differences in power dynamics. With low power distance cultures, which is what we are, we minimize class distinctions as well as status distinctions. Whereas and one person is just as powerful as another. Again, this follows with the individualistic culture, which we are a part, because if I am my own individual and I hold value, then I am just as valuable as someone else, so we do not tend to accept that unequal distribution of power. And in a organizational sense, we may think of low power distance as the boss that you're able to talk with. Maybe there's slight power differences, but overall we sort of get along where we can be friends with the boss. Whereas in high power distance cultures, this is where there is a high power distance and that is accepted. So we obey authority unquestioningly in these cultures. Also, so it is very much where there is a rigid hierarchy. Think too how your family culture. Do we obey the authority of the parent unquestioningly? Some cultures you do. What about grandparents? That would be even further up. Whereas in individualistic cultures, there may not be that big power difference. So we want to, while power is always going to be stratified, there's always going to be power difference. The amount of power stratification, the amount that we accept it, that is different. So let's define this a little bit more. In small power distance cultures, we emphasize interpersonal equality, whereas in large power distance, we emphasize status-based differences. Children may contradict parents versus children should obey parents. Younger people are more smart because they are individuals, whereas older people are wise. It is about looking up and emulating those parents. Teachers ask for feedback in small power distance cultures, whereas in large power distance cultures, teachers lecture. The teacher has more power, the student has less power. Whereas when teachers ask for feedback, the student's feedback is useful and can improve the overall quality of the teaching. Talk about that for being unwilling to accept the the power differences between teacher and student. That being said, there still is power difference, but there is also benefit to this smaller power distance in a teacher versus student relationship because the teacher can improve on things. Subordinates expect consultation, whereas subordinates expect guidance. Informal communication patterns with those of higher power, formal communication patterns with those who do not have those large power distances, who do have those large power distances. So as you can see, there are many differences in how we interact when we have these different mindsets. Next, we talk about uncertainty avoidance. In high uncertainty avoidance cultures, we need clear rules and regulations. In other words, uncertainty avoidance is the degree to which members of a culture feel threatened by ambiguous situations and strive to avoid them. So, by having clear rules and regulations, we avoid the uncertainty of making mistakes. Whereas in low uncertainty avoidance cultures, we feel less threatened by new and unexpected things and are willing to take more risks. Business. Low uncertainty avoidance cultures may have benefits associated with due to higher risk taking. Whereas in high uncertainty avoidance cultures, clear rules and regulations might be more adapted to that type of style. We also have weak uncertainty avoidance. So some things that identify these, where weak uncertainty avoidance cultures, uncertainty is valued. Strong uncertainty avoidance culture, uncertainty is a threat. Family is dynamic and always changing, creating some uncertainty, but in these other cultures, they reinforce family rules that we cannot change the relationship. High mobility in relationships, low mobility in relationships. So the relationships don't change. Challenges are welcome versus challenges are routine. Routines are welcome. Encourage risk taking versus encouraging clear procedure. Conflict can be positive. Conflict is negative. Again, when there's conflict, that challenges or creates some uncertainty on the relationship. High tolerance for ambiguity, low tolerance for ambiguity. So now that we understand uncertainty avoidance, now we focus on masculine and feminine roles. Masculine, also called achievement culture, places high value on material success and focuses on the task at hand, whereas nurturing culture is more focused in support of relationships, which is especially important in those situations. So, with these, feminine focuses on So, feminine and masculine cultures value very different things. Feminine values flexible sex roles or versus complementary sex roles. That, you know, that in a feminine culture, it allows for people to have many different ways of being. Whereas in masculine cultures, you be this way, I be this way. There is a breadwinner, there is a nurturer, complementing each other, but not very flexible. Emphasis on nurturance, emphasis on achievement. Both genders take initiative, males take initiative. Both genders, social adjustment is critical, academic performance is critical. Work in order to live versus live in order to work. Fluid gender communication, masculine toughness, feminine softness. And overlapped gender roles versus clear masculine, feminine gender roles. All of which to say, again, that there are many different ways that we can show this sort of difference. So that concludes these cultural value dimensions. Now we're going to be talking about some of the ways that culture intersects with many different types of things. We start with ethnicity and race. Race has little use in explaining individual differences. It explains differences between people whose ancestors originated in different regions of the world, and that is about it. The color of our skin does not mean all that much. Ethnicity is more commonly used. The degree to which a person identifies with a group, usually based on nationality, culture, or other unifying perspective. So, ethnicity is how we identify with the group. For example, I am Mexican. I'm proud of my culture, but that being said, I was raised in a very white, very Asian culture. So as a result, I I identify as a Mexican American, but I also have this sort of view of myself as uh, a little bit white, I guess I should say. That being said, intersectionality is the most accurate view, recognizing that culture is multidimensional. There's no single label that identifies a person. So if someone says to me, "You're not Mexican," I say, "Well, no, I am Mexican." If someone says, "You are not white," then I'm like, "No, I am white," because I can be both. So by understanding people as a tapestry of many different types of identities, that is a far more realistic and accurate view of people and culture. This speaks to salience because the thing that's drawn to mind most may be my Mexican heritage or my white heritage or my theater heritage or my culture co-culture or my democratic co-culture or my American co-culture, or we can go down the line. There are many different ways that we can identify, but by better so the thing that is called up most to the attention is the thing where which we communicate. Gender identity and sexual orientation, LGBTQ plus, means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, although that has been expanded quite a bit into many different areas. But when interacting with people of the, someone has told me this a term and I love it, the alphabet mafia, LGBTQ plus. Being open can give a sense of being authentic and belonging to a supportive co-culture. So we should strive to be very inclusive of people of all differences. Disclosure of a gender identity can be very risky. Um, there are examples, even personal examples that I've seen of people being disowned because of their gender identity. So we have to be inclusive of people, but we have to also understand that there are risks associated with disclosing one's gender identity, so that we should not strive to push people out of their comfort zone in this respect. Social climate has become more receptive to LGBTQ plus individuals as well. So that is a positive. Age and generation can also affect things. Age-related communication reflects culture as much as biology. That what are some of the most formative moments of those who are 50 to 70 versus 10 to 20? So we have different cultures. Western cultures honor youth, as we've said before, whereas in Eastern cultures or more collectivistic cultures, we more value uh, um, experience, age. People who believe older adults have trouble communicating are less likely to interact with them and more likely to use patronizing speech when they do interact. Age, just like any other difference, is an intercultural difference. So we have to be able to communicate with people of any group to be an intercultural competent communicator. So we should not act in patronizing ways to the elderly, just like we should not act patronizingly to those who are young. Communication challenges can arise when different generations work together, just like with any other intercultural communication context. We also have socioeconomic status. Working class, middle class, upper class identifications can affect how and with whom we communicate. Randomly on an Uber ride, some person said, rich people stay with rich, poor people stay with poor. And of course, I guess I can understand it, but it's something else to understand that uh, we can learn a great deal from many different perspectives. And by limiting ourselves to one socioeconomic status, we remove any opportunity to learn more about ourselves. So, next, we talk about first generation college students may feel intercultural strain of two worlds, which may result in an extra effort to assimilate or self censorship to avoid being a traitor to their class. And uh, we will move on now to verbal codes. Verbal codes are members speak a dominant language and some speak a minority language. The sense of being a member of an outgroup is strong. So there are different ways that we communicate, and as we've said, with directness or indirectness, elaborating a lot or succinctness, formality of communication or informality of communication, all of which are verbal codes that can reinforce some of this in-group, out-group dynamic. Nonverbal codes are people of all cultures convey messages through facial expressions and gestures. There's a tremendous range in nonverbal communication, so silence is also used in many different ways. So how do we decode some of these messages? Well, we have to keep in mind our attribution. Our attributions we form some sort of interpretation of what others' words and actions mean. Ambiguous behavior can be interpreted in several different ways. So we want to be sure that we are attributing accurately and kindly, frankly, because while someone may shock us by being impolite in a or blunt or too passive or talking to a elder not the way that I expect, challenging an elder, all of which are interculturally bound. So we have to better understand that, and that means developing intercultural communication competence. This involves motivation and attitude. You have to desire to change. Also, you have to have some tolerance for ambiguity, that there is uncertainty regarding intercultural communication, because if you talk with people who are different, you can make mistakes. So so it is challenging and it is scary a little bit, but the benefits are vast. Also, we want to be open-minded. Beware of ethnocentrism, beware of prejudice, and beware of stereotyping. Ethnocentrism is seeing that my side is right, and prejudice is seeing some other group as bad, and then stereotyping is seeing one group as the same. That one identifying characteristic is reflective of this group. So we also want to develop our knowledge and skills. Be mindful. Engage in passive observation. Look to see how can I better understand them. Active strategies can include engaging with them and using appropriate self-disclosure. Disclosing some things, some challenges that you have, can be useful. And patience and perseverance, though, is key. There is always going to be a transition of culture shock. But by pushing through it, we can eventually adapt and be successful. One other thing to keep in mind, no one has ever been insulted by listening, by someone listening too much to them. By listening, we improve our mindfulness. We engage in some of this active strategy to better learn different people's perspectives. So we move from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, knowing that we messed up. That's an interesting step because when we are unconscious, we tend to see ourselves as okay as communicating these with many different types of different people. Then, when we jump to conscious incompetence, it seems like we've taken a step down, and that's where people have lost their willingness and perseverance to overcome this challenge. But that is actually a step up, showing that, oh, I do have things to learn. Then we jump to conscious competence. That's when we start to get the hang of it. We improve. And then we jump eventually, and our ideal is unconscious competence, where we are interculturally competent, but we are not focusing on it. We can even use the ODIS method of observing language and nonverbal signals attentively, describing specific behaviors with a minimum of distortion, generate multiple interpretations of unfamiliar behavior, and suspend ethnocentric evaluations. This is very similar to our perception check, and that concludes intercultural communication. Have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you next time.